What if I told you that in 1861, in the heart of Alabama's cotton fields, a man walked to freedom right under his master's noses? Not by running through the night, not by hiding in shadows, but by using their own trust as his weapon. This is the story of Julius, a slave who turned obedience into the perfect disguise and made the impossible look ordinary. If stories of incredible human courage fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The morning sun cast long shadows across Whitmore Plantation as Julius Jenkins adjusted the worn leather strap of his tool bag. At 28 years old, he had spent every day of his life on this Alabama cotton farm, watching the seasons change from the same dusty fields, hearing the same crack of the overseer's whip, feeling the same weight of chains, both visible and invisible. But today was different. Today, Julius would begin the most dangerous performance of his life. The plantation stretched endlessly in every direction, a kingdom of white cotton bolls and human misery. Julius had memorized every acre of it during his years of bondage. The rich bottomland near the creek where the cotton grew tallest, the rocky hillsides where corn struggled in the thin soil, the dense woods that bordered the property and whispered promises of freedom to those brave enough to listen. He knew which overseers were cruel and which were merely indifferent, which dogs were trained to track human scent, and which roads led away from this place of perpetual servitude. Most importantly, Julius had spent years studying the white people who owned him, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their blind spots. He had discovered that their greatest vulnerability was their absolute certainty in their own superiority. They saw what they expected to see, a simple, loyal slave who would never dare to dream of freedom, much less act upon such dreams. "Julius!" The sharp voice of Master Thomas Whitmore cut through the humid air like a blade. "Get over here, boy!" Julius's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained perfectly composed, the mask he had perfected over decades of survival. He jogged toward the plantation house, his movements deliberate and unhurried, exactly as expected from Whitmore's most trusted field hand. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and the air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms from the trees that lined the drive to the big house. "Yes, Master Whitmore," Julius said, removing his worn hat and lowering his eyes in practiced submission. The gesture was so automatic that it required no conscious thought, a survival mechanism honed by years of necessity. Thomas Whitmore stood on the wraparound porch of his grand white mansion, his belly straining against a silk vest despite the early hour. Beside him, his wife Margaret fanned herself delicately, her pale skin protected from the Alabama sun by layers of lace and propriety. The contrast between their leisurely morning and Julius's dawn-to-dusk labor was stark, a visual reminder of the vast gulf that separated master from slave. Behind them, through the open windows of the house, Julius could hear the sounds of the Whitmore children being served breakfast by house slaves, the clink of fine china and silver, the murmur of polite conversation, the rustle of silk dresses, all the trappings of a civilization built on the backs of human bondage. "I need you to take a message to the Hartwell plantation," Whitmore said, pulling a sealed envelope from his coat pocket. "Old Hartwell's expecting news about the cotton prices from Mobile. You know the way?" Julius's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, praying for, planning around for months. "Yes, sir, Master Whitmore. The Hartwell place, about 15 miles north on the main road." "That's right, and Julius—" Whitmore's pale blue eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a man who had never doubted his absolute authority. "This is important business. I'm trusting you because you've never given me cause for concern. Don't make me regret that trust." The irony was almost overwhelming. Whitmore was trusting him precisely because Julius had spent years building this reputation for reliability and loyalty. Every act of apparent submission, every display of contentment with his lot, had been a carefully calculated investment in this moment. "No, sir, Master Whitmore. You can count on me." Margaret Whitmore looked up from her fan, her voice carrying the honeyed poison of southern gentility. "Thomas, are you certain it's wise to send him alone, with all this talk of war and unrest among the coloured folk?" Julius felt the familiar burn of rage in his chest. But he had learned long ago to transform that fire into fuel for his mind rather than his fists. He stood perfectly still, playing the role of the simple, loyal slave who couldn't possibly understand the implications of their conversation. Inside, however, his mind was cataloguing every word, every gesture, every sign of the growing tension that was beginning to fracture the foundations of the South. "Margaret, Julius here is different from the others," Whitmore said with the casual confidence of a man discussing livestock. "He's been with our family since birth. His mama was my father's most trusted house servant. Some of them are born with sense, and Julius has got more sense than most. Don't you, boy?" "I just tried to do right by you and Miss Margaret, sir," Julius replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Each syllable was a small betrayal of his true feelings, but also a necessary step toward freedom. Whitmore nodded approvingly and handed him the envelope. The paper was heavy and expensive, sealed with red wax that bore the Whitmore family crest. "Take the wagon. Should be back before sunset. And Julius, if anyone stops you on the road, you show them this." He produced a folded paper from his vest. "It's a travel pass with my signature. Explains your business." Julius accepted both documents with steady hands, though inside his mind was racing. The travel pass was like a key to a door he had never dared hope would open. It would give him legitimate reason to be on the roads, protection from the slave patrols that constantly hunted for runaways. More importantly, it would allow him to travel in broad daylight when most escaped slaves would be hiding in swamps and forests. "Thank you, Master Whitmore. I'll be careful with your business." As Julius walked toward the barn where the wagon waited, he could feel the weight of eyes upon him. Other slaves working in the yard, picking vegetables, hanging laundry, repairing tools, watched him with expressions that ranged from envy to concern. They all knew that being singled out by the master could be either a blessing or a curse, and the difference often wasn't clear until it was too late. Julius. The voice belonged to Moses, an older man whose back was permanently bent from decades of cotton picking. He approached slowly, his weathered hands never stopping their work on a broken harness. Moses had been on the plantation longer than anyone, a living repository of its history and its secrets. "You be careful out there, son. Roads ain't safe these days." Julius understood the deeper meaning. Moses had been on the plantation longer than anyone, had seen slaves disappear in the night and never return. Some were sold away, others tried to run and were brought back broken, and a few simply vanished without explanation. The old man's eyes held knowledge of things that were never spoken aloud in the quarters. "I'll be careful, Uncle Moses," Julius said, using the term of respect that acknowledged the older man's wisdom and experience. Moses nodded, but his eyes held a question that Julius couldn't answer, not here, not now, not with so many ears listening and so many eyes watching. The old man had survived by learning to read between the lines, to understand what was not said as clearly as what was spoken aloud. Julius hitched the wagon with practiced efficiency, his movements automatic after years of routine. The horse, a gentle mare named Belle, nickered softly as he checked her harness. She had carried him on errands before, and her calm temperament would be crucial for what he planned to do. Belle was one of the few creatures on the plantation that Julius felt genuine affection for. She had never judged him, never demanded submission, never treated him as anything less than a fellow living being. As he climbed onto the wagon seat, Julius caught sight of his reflection in the brass fitting of the harness. The face that looked back at him was unremarkable. Brown skin weathered by sun and work, intelligent eyes that he had learned to keep carefully neutral, a strong jaw that he kept relaxed to avoid appearing defiant. It was the face of a slave, exactly what everyone expected to see, but behind that carefully constructed mask, Julius's mind was sharp as a razor and twice as dangerous. He had taught himself to read by watching the Whitmore children's lessons through windows, had learned about the wider world by listening to conversations he was supposed to ignore, had studied the habits and weaknesses of every white person on the plantation with the intensity of a general planning a campaign, and now, finally, he had his chance. Julius guided the wagon down the long drive that led away from the plantation house, past the slave quarters where children played in the dust and women prepared the midday meal over open fires. Some waved as he passed, and he waved back, playing his part perfectly. But with each turn of the wheels, he was moving closer to the moment when Julius Jenkins, the slave, would cease to exist. The main road stretched ahead of him, dusty and rutted from recent rains. To anyone watching, he was simply Julius Jenkins, Master Whitmore's trusted slave, running an errand for his owner. The travel pass in his pocket gave him legitimate reason to be on the road, and his calm demeanor suggested nothing more than dutiful obedience. But Julius's heart was pounding with the rhythm of freedom, and every turn of the wagon wheels carried him closer to a destiny he had been planning for months. The Hartwell plantation was indeed 15 miles north, but Julius had no intention of ever arriving there. As the plantation disappeared behind a grove of oak trees, Julius allowed himself one quick glance back at the only home he had ever known. Then he faced forward, toward the unknown, toward danger, toward the possibility of freedom that burned in his chest like a flame that could never be extinguished. The first phase of his plan was complete. Now came the truly dangerous part. 3 miles from Whitmore Plantation, Julius encountered his first test. A group of white men on horseback approached from the opposite direction. Their faces flushed with heat and something that looked like excitement. Julius recognized the type immediately. Local farmers and merchants who had formed themselves into informal patrols since talk of war had begun spreading through Alabama like wildfire. The sight of them sent a chill down Julius's spine. But he forced himself to maintain the steady pace that would mark him as a slave on legitimate business. These men were dangerous, not just because of their weapons and their authority, but because they represented the collective paranoia of a society that was beginning to sense its own vulnerability. Every escaped slave was a crack in the foundation of their world, a reminder that the system they depended on was not as secure as they believed. Julius's hands tightened imperceptibly on the reins, but his posture remained relaxed and deferential. This was the moment when everything could go wrong, when his carefully laid plans could crumble with a single suspicious glance or poorly chosen word. He had rehearsed this encounter in his mind countless times, but the reality was more terrifying than any imagined scenario. The lead rider was a man Julius had seen before at the county courthouse, a prosperous farmer named Jake Morrison, who owned several hundred acres and a dozen slaves of his own. Morrison's face was red from the sun and from the whiskey that Julius could smell even from a distance. His companions were cut from the same cloth, men who had built their prosperity on the backs of enslaved labor and who would defend that system with their lives. "Hold up there, boy!" Morrison called out, raising his hand in a gesture that was both greeting and command. Julius brought the wagon to a stop and immediately removed his hat, his eyes fixed on the ground in perfect submission. "Yes, sir," Julius said, his voice carrying just the right note of nervous respect. He had studied the speech patterns of successful house slaves, learning to modulate his tone to suggest intelligence without threatening white authority. "Where you headed with that wagon?" Morrison's horse pranced sideways, sensing its rider's agitation. The animal's nervousness added to the tension of the moment, creating an atmosphere where violence could erupt with little provocation. "Master Whitmore sent me to the Hartwell place, sir. Got a message about cotton prices." Julius reached slowly into his pocket, telegraphing his movements to avoid startling the increasingly agitated men. "Got my travel pass right here, sir." The mention of Whitmore's name had the desired effect. Thomas Whitmore was well respected in the county, a man whose word carried weight in business and social circles. His endorsement of Julius's mission would carry significant authority with men like Morrison. He handed over the folded paper with steady hands, though inside his heart was hammering so hard he was certain they could hear it. The pass was genuine, written in Whitmore's own hand and bearing his official seal. It was Julius's shield against suspicion, his protection against the assumption that any black man on the road must be a runaway. Morrison unfolded the pass and squinted at it, his lips moving slightly as he read. Julius could see the man's education was limited, but he was literate enough to understand the document's significance. The other riders crowded closer, their horses stamping and snorting in the dust. "Thomas Whitmore, eh? Good man, Whitmore. Knows how to handle his property." Morrison's eyes swept over Julius with the casual assessment of someone evaluating livestock. "You been with the Whitmore family long, boy?" "All my life, sir. My mama worked in the big house before she passed." The lie came easily, supported by years of observation and careful preparation. Julius had studied the histories of long-term plantation slaves, learning the patterns of their lives and the ways they spoke about their experiences. "And you never gave them any trouble, never got ideas above your station." Julius allowed a look of genuine confusion to cross his face, an expression he had practiced in the mirror of still water in the slave quarters. "Sir, I don't understand. Master Whitmore treats me fair, and I do my work. Don't know what other ideas I'd have." The performance was flawless. Julius had spent years observing how the good slaves, the ones who survived and sometimes even prospered within the system, presented themselves to white authority. He had studied their body language, their speech patterns, their careful balance of respect and simplicity that made white people comfortable with their own superiority. One of the other men, younger with nervous eyes that darted constantly between Julius and the surrounding countryside, leaned forward in his saddle. "Jake, you hear about that trouble over in Montgomery? 3 slaves went missing from the Patterson place, just vanished in the night." Morrison spat into the dust, the brown stream landing dangerously close to Bell's hooves. "I heard. That's why we're keeping an eye on the roads. Can't be too careful these days, what with all this war talk stirring folks up." His gaze returned to Julius with renewed intensity. "You hear anything about slaves running off, boy? Any talk in the quarters?" Julius's expression remained perfectly blank, but inside his mind was racing. This was exactly the kind of information he had hoped to avoid, but it also told him something crucial. The authorities were already on high alert. His plan would have to be even more carefully executed than he had originally thought. The mention of war was particularly significant. The growing tension between North and South was creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made any unusual activity seem potentially threatening. "No, sir," Julius said, shaking his head slowly. "Folks in our quarters, they just talk about work and family. Master Whitmore, he keeps us busy and fed. Don't hear much complaining." It was exactly the kind of response that would reassure men like Morrison. The image of contented slaves, grateful for their master's benevolence, was central to the mythology that justified the entire system of bondage. Julius was playing into their deepest beliefs about the natural order of things. Morrison nodded approvingly and handed back the travel pass. "That's what I like to hear. You tell your master that Jake Morrison and his boys are keeping the roads safe. Any trouble, any suspicious activity, we'll handle it." "Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison. I'll tell Master Whitmore you're looking out for his interests. See that you do, and boy." Morrison's voice carried a warning that made Julius's skin crawl. "You remember what happens to slaves who get ideas about running. Remember what happened to that buck they brought back from the Jennings place last month." Julius did remember. The man had been made an example of in front of slaves from 3 different plantations, his punishment so severe that even the hardest overseers had looked away. The memory was burned into Julius's mind, a constant reminder of what awaited him if his plan failed. But rather than deterring him, the memory only strengthened his resolve. A life lived in constant fear of such brutality was no life at all. "Yes, sir, I remember." Morrison nodded curtly and spurred his horse forward. "Move along then, and keep your eyes open. See anything suspicious, you report it when you get back." "Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison." Julius waited until the patrol had disappeared around a bend in the road before allowing himself to breathe normally again. His hands were trembling slightly as he picked up the reins, but his mind was clearer than ever. The encounter had given him valuable intelligence about the current state of security in the area, and more importantly, it had proven that his disguise was working. The patrol's mention of war was particularly significant. Julius had heard whispers in the slave quarters about the growing tension between North and South, about states seceding from the Union, about the possibility of a conflict that might change everything. If war came, it would create chaos and opportunity in equal measure. The established order would be disrupted, and in that disruption, a clever man might find chances that would never exist in peacetime. As the wagon rolled forward, Julius began to implement the next phase of his plan. He had studied the route to the Hartwell plantation many times, memorizing every crossroads, every landmark, every possible escape route. But more importantly, he had identified the perfect place to disappear. 5 miles ahead, the main road crossed Willow Creek at a stone bridge. Just before the bridge, a smaller road branched off to the east, leading to several smaller farms and eventually to the town of Millerville. It was at this junction that Julius would make his move, transforming from slave to free man in the space of a few crucial minutes. But first, he had to prepare. Reaching under the wagon seat, Julius retrieved a bundle he had hidden there during his morning preparations. Inside was a change of clothes, not slave clothes, but the simple work garments of a free black man. He had acquired them piece by piece over months, trading small items and favors with other slaves who had connections beyond the plantation. More importantly, the bundle contained papers, forged documents that identified him as Julius Freeman, a free black man traveling to visit relatives in Millerville. The papers were crude by professional standards, but they would pass casual inspection, especially if the person examining them wasn't looking too closely. Julius had learned to forge documents by watching the plantation's bookkeeper work, memorizing the formation of letters and the style of official seals. It had taken him months to perfect the skill, practicing with charcoal on scraps of wood that he burned immediately after use. The risk had been enormous. Discovery would have meant certain death, but the skill was essential to his plan. As Willow Creek came into view, Julius's pulse quickened. This was the point of no return. Once he left the main road, there would be no innocent explanation for his presence. He would be a runaway slave, subject to capture, punishment, and quite possibly death, but he would also be free. By midday, Julius had covered nearly 10 miles on the back roads leading away from Whitmore Plantation. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Alabama countryside, and sweat soaked through his carefully chosen free man's clothing. But despite the heat and the constant fear of discovery, Julius felt more alive than he had in years. The transformation from slave to free man was more than just a change of clothes. It was a complete reimagining of how he moved through the world. As Julius Jenkins, he had learned to make himself small, invisible, unthreatening. But as Julius Freeman, he had to project the quiet confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to be. It was a dangerous balancing act that required constant vigilance. Too much confidence would mark him as uppity and draw unwanted attention from white authorities who expected deference from all black men, free or enslaved. Too little would make him seem suspicious, like a slave trying to pass for free. Julius had to find the perfect middle ground, respectful but not servile, confident but not challenging. The countryside through which he travelled was a patchwork of small farms and dense woodlands, punctuated by the occasional grand plantation house visible in the distance. Each property told a story of the complex social hierarchy that defined the antebellum South, from the modest holdings of yeoman farmers who worked their own land, to the vast estates of the planter aristocracy who commanded hundreds of slaves and thousands of acres. Julius had studied this landscape for years, learning not just its geography, but its social dynamics. He knew which roads were heavily traveled and which were isolated, which communities were sympathetic to runaway slaves and which were hostile. Most importantly, he had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the political leanings of different areas, the presence of certain churches, the style of architecture, even the way people dressed and spoke. His first real test came as he approached the outskirts of Millerville. A white man in a dusty coat was walking along the road ahead, leading a limping horse. The man's clothes marked him as a working farmer rather than a plantation owner, but that didn't necessarily make him less dangerous. Poor whites often harbored the deepest resentment toward free blacks, seeing them as competition for jobs and social status. Julius's instinct was to dismount and offer assistance, the behavior expected of a slave. But a free black man would approach the situation differently, with more caution and less automatic deference. The decision of how to respond could mean the difference between maintaining his cover and exposing himself as a fraud. "Afternoon," Julius called out as he drew near, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he had practiced. "Looks like you're having some trouble there." The man looked up, his face flushed with heat and frustration. He was middle-aged, with the calloused hands of someone who worked for a living, rather than owned others who worked for him. His clothes were worn but clean, suggesting a man who took pride in his appearance despite his modest circumstances. "Horse threw a shoe about a mile back," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a grimy sleeve. "Been walking ever since. Damn animal picked the worst possible time for this nonsense." Julius dismounted and approached slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening while projecting the confidence of a man who had every right to be where he was. "I know a bit about horses. Mind if I take a look?" The white man hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain about accepting help from a black man, even a free one. Julius could see the internal struggle playing out on the man's face, the need for assistance warring with ingrained prejudices about racial hierarchy. But the heat and his obvious exhaustion won out over his prejudices. "I'd be obliged," he said finally, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Julius examined the horse's hoof with practiced hands, his mind racing as he worked. This interaction could go several ways, and each one carried its own dangers. If he appeared too knowledgeable, it might raise questions about where a free black man had learned such skills. If he seemed incompetent, the man might become suspicious about his story. The horse was a sturdy working animal, well cared for, but showing the wear of hard use. The missing shoe had left the hoof tender and slightly damaged, but nothing that couldn't be easily repaired with the right tools and materials. "Looks like the shoe just worked loose," Julius said after a moment, his diagnosis delivered with quiet confidence. probably hit a rock wrong. You got any nails in your saddlebags?" The man nodded and rummaged through his gear, producing a handful of horseshoe nails and a small hammer. Julius worked quickly and efficiently, his movements confident but not showy. As he worked, he engaged in the kind of casual conversation that would establish his cover story while gathering information about the local situation. "Heading into Millerville myself," Julius said, positioning a nail carefully. "Got family there I haven't seen in a while." "That's so." The man's tone was neutral, but Julius could sense him evaluating every word, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. "What kind of work you do?" "Bit of everything," Julius replied, which was true enough. "Carpentry, some blacksmithing, farm work when it's available. Whatever keeps food on the table." It was a perfect answer, vague enough to avoid detailed questions, but specific enough to sound legitimate. Free black men in Alabama often worked multiple jobs, taking whatever employment they could find in a society that limited their opportunities at every turn. The skills Julius claimed were exactly the kind that a free black man might possess, learned through apprenticeship or necessity. "Times are hard for working folks," the man said, testing his horse's gait as Julius finished with the horseshoe. "All this talk of war's got everyone nervous, don't know what's coming next." Julius nodded sympathetically, recognizing an opportunity to gather more intelligence about the current political situation. "Heard some talk about that myself. Folks seem pretty stirred up about things." "Stirred up's putting it mildly. Half the county's ready to march off and fight the Yankees, other half thinks we ought to stay in the Union. Makes for some heated conversations at the general store, I can tell you that." The information was valuable. A divided community would be more focused on political disputes than on hunting runaway slaves. But it also meant that tensions were running high, and people were more likely to be suspicious of strangers. "Name's William Garrett," the man said as Julius finished with the horseshoe. "I run a small farm about 5 miles south of town." "Julius Freeman," Julius replied, the false name rolling off his tongue as if he had been using it his entire life. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Garrett." Garrett tested his horse's gait, nodding approvingly as the animal moved without favoring the previously injured hoof. "That's fine work, Julius. You got a good hand with horses." "Just glad I could help." Garrett reached into his pocket and produced a small coin. "For your trouble." Julius hesitated. Accepting payment would reinforce his cover as a working free man, but it also felt wrong to take money for helping someone in need. In the end, practicality won out. The coin would add authenticity to his story and might prove useful later. "Thank you, sir. Much appreciated." As they parted ways, Julius felt a mixture of relief and growing confidence. The encounter had gone perfectly. He had established his identity as Julius Freeman, demonstrated useful skills that explained his presence on the road, and even earned a small amount of money that added authenticity to his story. But as he rode into Millerville, Julius's confidence was tempered by the reality of his situation. The town was larger than he had expected, with several hundred residents and a bustling main street lined with shops and businesses. More people meant more opportunities for his story to be questioned, more chances for someone to recognize him as a runaway slave. Millerville's main street was a study in the complex social dynamics of the antebellum South. White merchants and customers dominated the boardwalks and storefronts, while free blacks and slaves moved through the spaces left to them with careful attention to the unwritten rules that governed every interaction. Julius guided Belle to a hitching post outside a general store, his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. A group of white men stood talking outside the barbershop, their conversation animated, and their gestures suggesting they were discussing something important. 2 black women, probably slaves sent on errands, hurried past with baskets of goods, their eyes fixed on the ground. It was into this complex social landscape that Julius Freeman had to insert himself without raising suspicion. He approached the general store with measured steps, neither hurrying nor dawdling. The key was to appear as if he belonged exactly where he was, conducting legitimate business in a town where he had every right to be. The store's interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight outside. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from farming tools to bolts of cloth. The smell of coffee, tobacco, and leather goods created an atmosphere of commerce and prosperity. Behind the counter, a thin white man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up as Julius entered. "Help you with something?" the shopkeeper asked, his tone neutral but watchful. Julius could sense the man's uncertainty about how to treat him, the careful calculation that all white Southerners made when encountering a black man whose status was unclear. "Yes, sir," Julius replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that stopped just short of subservience. "Looking to buy some supplies for the road, maybe some jerky and hardtack if you've got it." The shopkeeper nodded and began gathering the requested items, his movements efficient but cautious. "Traveling far?" "Heading north," Julius said, which was true as far as it went. "Got work waiting in Tennessee." It was another carefully crafted lie. Tennessee was far enough away to explain why he wasn't well known in the area, but not so far as to seem implausible for a working man to travel. More importantly, it suggested he was leaving Alabama rather than trying to establish himself locally, which might make people less likely to ask detailed questions about his background. As the shopkeeper wrapped his purchases, Julius became aware of a conversation taking place near the front of the store. Two white men were discussing something in low, urgent tones, and certain words caught his attention. "Runaway, Whitmore, reward." Julius's blood turned to ice, but he forced himself to remain calm. He paid for his supplies with steady hands and thanked the shopkeeper politely, all while straining to hear more of the conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. "Found the wagon abandoned by Willow Creek," one of the men was saying. "Horse was gone, and so was the slave. Whitmore's offering $50 for his return." $50. It was more money than most people in Millerville would see in months, enough to make every white man in town a potential bounty hunter. Julius's carefully planned escape had just become exponentially more dangerous. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Julius found himself facing the greatest challenge of his escape. The road north from Millerville led through a narrow valley where the main route was the only practical passage for miles. It was exactly the kind of natural choke point where authorities would set up roadblocks to catch runaway slaves. The landscape around him had grown more rugged as he traveled north, with rolling hills covered in dense forest, giving way to steeper terrain carved by ancient streams. The road wound through cuts in the hillsides, creating natural ambush points where a small group of men could control all traffic. Julius had studied maps of this area during his months of planning, but seeing it in person made him realize how vulnerable he would be if cornered here. Julius's fears were confirmed as he crested a small hill and saw what lay ahead. 3 men on horseback had positioned themselves across the road, and even from a distance he could see the glint of metal that suggested they were armed. Behind them, a wagon blocked the passage completely, forcing any traveler to stop and submit to questioning. The sight sent a chill through Julius that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. This was no casual patrol like the one he had encountered that morning. This was a deliberate trap, set with military precision and designed to catch exactly what he was, a runaway slave trying to escape to freedom. For a moment, Julius considered turning back, but he quickly realized that retreat was no longer an option. Other riders were approaching from behind, probably more members of the search party that was undoubtedly spreading out across the countryside like a net designed to catch him. He was caught between 2 groups of hunters, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The irony was bitter. He had come so far, overcome so many obstacles, only to be trapped in this desolate valley with freedom tantalizingly close. But Julius had not survived 28 years of slavery by giving up when faced with impossible odds. If this was to be his final performance, he would make it his masterpiece. It was time for the performance of his life. Julius straightened his shoulders and urged Bell forward at a steady pace. Everything depended on his ability to convince these men that he was exactly what his papers claimed, a free black man traveling legally through Alabama with nothing to hide. The weight of the forged documents in his pocket felt both reassuring and terrifying, a lifeline that could either save him or damn him depending on how well his deception held up under scrutiny. As he approached the roadblock, Julius could see the men more clearly. The leader was a tall, lean man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, his face weathered by years of outdoor work and marked by the kind of hard lines that came from making difficult decisions. His companions looked like local farmers or merchants, the kind of men who would be eager to claim a $50 reward, but who might also be swayed by a convincing performance. "Hold up there!" the sheriff called out as Julius approached. The man's hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was both casual and threatening. "State your business." Julius brought Bell to a stop and removed his hat with practiced deference, but not the exaggerated submission that would mark him as a slave. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of respectful cooperation. "Where you headed, boy?" the sheriff asked, his eyes scanning Julius from head to toe, looking for any detail that might betray his true identity. "North to Tennessee, sir. Got work waiting for me there." Julius reached slowly into his pocket, telegraphing his movements to avoid startling the increasingly tense men. "Got my papers right here if you need to see them." The sheriff accepted the forged documents and unfolded them carefully, his eyes scanning the crude but convincing text. Julius had spent weeks perfecting those papers, studying official documents and practicing the handwriting until he could reproduce the style of various clerks and magistrates. Every line, every flourish, every official-looking seal had been crafted with painstaking attention to detail. "Julius Freeman," the sheriff read aloud, his voice carrying a note of skepticism that made Julius's heart race. "Says here you're a free man, born in Georgia, currently residing in." He squinted at the paper. "Macon County." "Yes, sir. Been working there for the past 2 years, but the work's drying up. Heard there's opportunities in Tennessee for a man with carpentry skills." It was a plausible story, backed up by details that Julius had carefully researched. Macon County was far enough away that these men were unlikely to have detailed knowledge of its residents, but close enough that his presence in Alabama wouldn't seem unusual. The mention of carpentry work was calculated to suggest valuable skills that would make him employable in Tennessee. One of the other men, a heavy-set farmer with suspicious eyes and the soft hands of someone who supervised rather than performed manual labor, leaned forward in his saddle. "Sheriff, we're looking for a runaway from the Whitmore place. About his age, about his size. How do we know this ain't him with fake papers?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over Julius's head. This was the moment he had feared most, when his carefully constructed identity would be put to the ultimate test. But he had prepared for this possibility, and now he played his cards with the skill of a master gambler. Julius's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his expression to remain calm and slightly confused. "Runaway, sir? I'm sorry, I don't understand. I've been free all my life." The performance was perfect, just the right mixture of confusion and concern that an innocent man might display when confronted with such an accusation. Julius had studied the reactions of truly free black men when questioned by authorities, learning to mimic their body language and speech patterns. The sheriff studied Julius's face intently, looking for any sign of deception. Years of law enforcement had taught him to read people, to spot the telltale signs of guilt and fear that marked the guilty. But Julius had spent his entire life learning to hide his true feelings, to present whatever face the situation required. "You hear anything about a slave running off? Any talk on the roads?" "No, sir," Julius replied, allowing a note of concern to enter his voice. "Is that why you're stopping folks? Should I be worried about traveling alone?" It was a masterful touch, turning the question back on them and expressing the kind of concern that a legitimate traveler might feel upon learning about dangerous fugitives in the area. The implication was clear. Julius Freeman was a law-abiding citizen who would naturally be concerned about his own safety. The sheriff folded the papers and handed them back, but his expression remained skeptical. "These papers look legitimate enough, but papers easy to forge. You got any other way to prove you are who you say you are?" Julius's mind raced. This was the moment he had feared most, when his carefully constructed identity would be put to the ultimate test. But he had prepared for this possibility, and now he played his final card. "Well, sir," Julius said, reaching into his other pocket with deliberate slowness, "I've got this letter from my employer in Tennessee. Mr. Harrison wrote it himself, confirming the work he's got waiting for me." The letter was another forgery, but it was Julius's masterpiece. He had spent weeks perfecting not just the handwriting, but the paper, the ink, even the way the letter was folded. It looked exactly like what it claimed to be: correspondence from a Tennessee businessman to a skilled craftsman he was eager to employ. The sheriff read the letter carefully, his frown deepening as he absorbed the details. Julius had filled it with specific information about carpentry work, wages, and living arrangements, the kind of details that would be difficult to fake convincingly. "Says here you built a church steeple in Macon County," the sheriff said, looking up from the letter. "That's skilled work. Where'd you learn carpentry?" "My father taught me, sir. He was a free man, too, worked for a builder in Georgia. Started teaching me the trade when I was just a boy." The story was entirely fictional, but Julius told it with the conviction of lived experience. He had spent months imagining every detail of Julius Freeman's life, creating a complete history that would stand up to questioning. The heavy-set farmer wasn't satisfied. "Sheriff, I still say we should take him back to town. Let Whitmore have a look at him. $50 is $50. Julius felt a chill of fear, but he forced himself to respond with the indignation of an innocent man wrongly accused. "Sir, I understand you're trying to do your duty, but I've got work waiting for me in Tennessee. If you delay me much longer, I might lose the position." The sheriff studied Julius for a long moment, weighing the evidence before him. The papers looked legitimate, the story was plausible, and the man's demeanor suggested someone with nothing to hide. But $50 was a substantial reward, and the pressure to catch the runaway was intense. "Tell you what," the sheriff said finally, "I'm going to let you pass, but I want you to understand something. If you're lying to me, if you're the slave we're looking for, we will catch you. And when we do, you'll wish you'd never been born." "I understand, sir," Julius replied, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "But I'm telling you the truth. I'm Julius Freeman, and I'm a free man traveling to legitimate work in Tennessee." The sheriff nodded curtly and gestured for his men to move the wagon aside. "Move along then, and Freeman, you see any sign of that runaway, you report it to the nearest authority. There's dangerous men hunting him, and you don't want to get caught in the middle." "Yes, sir, Sheriff. I'll keep my eyes open." As the roadblock cleared, Julius guided Bell forward at a steady pace, every muscle in his body screaming with the effort of appearing calm. He could feel the eyes of the three men boring into his back as he rode away, and he knew that any sign of haste or relief would bring them thundering after him. Only when he had crested the next hill and the roadblock was out of sight did Julius allow himself to breathe normally again. The most dangerous part of his journey was behind him, but he was far from safe. The search would continue, and his description would be circulated throughout the region. But he had done it. He had walked through the heart of enemy territory, looked his hunters in the eye, and convinced them that he was someone else entirely. Julius Jenkins, the slave, was dead and buried beside Willow Creek. Julius Freeman, the free man, rode north toward a future that belonged to him alone. 3 months later, a letter arrived at a small church in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was addressed to the pastor, a man known for his work with the Underground Railroad, and it bore the careful handwriting of someone who had taught himself to read and write. Reverend Williams, the letter began, I hope this finds you well. I am writing to let you know that Julius Freeman has arrived safely in Ohio and has found work with a furniture maker who values skill over the color of a man's skin. I wanted you to know that your network of friends helped guide me to safety during the final stages of my journey north. The letter went on to describe a new life built from nothing but determination and hope. Julius Freeman had indeed become a skilled carpenter, earning enough to rent a small room and even send money to help other escaped slaves make their way north. He had learned to read and write with fluency, attended church regularly, and was courting a young woman who had herself escaped from bondage in Kentucky. But perhaps most remarkably, the letter revealed that Julius Freeman had begun working with the Underground Railroad, using his experience and intelligence to help others escape the bonds of slavery. The man who had walked to freedom in broad daylight was now helping others find their own paths to liberation. I want you to know, the letter concluded, that every day I wake up as a free man, I remember that freedom is not just the absence of chains, it is the presence of choice. I choose to help others find what I found, to pass on the gift that was given to me by those brave enough to believe that all men are created equal. The slave named Julius Jenkins died beside Willow Creek in Alabama, but Julius Freeman lives on, and he will never stop fighting for the day when no man, woman, or child will know the weight of bondage. Your friend in freedom, Julius Freeman. Back in Alabama, the story of the slave who had vanished in broad daylight became legend. Some said he had been helped by abolitionists, others claimed he had supernatural powers. Master Whitmore never stopped believing that his trusted slave would return, unable to comprehend that the man he thought he knew had been planning his escape for years. But those who knew the truth understood that Julius's escape was neither magic nor luck. It was the triumph of human intelligence over a system designed to crush the human spirit. He had proven that the most powerful weapon against oppression is not violence, but the refusal to accept that freedom is anything less than a birthright. The road from Whitmore Plantation to freedom had been paved with courage, cunning, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of a better life. Julius Freeman had walked that road in broad daylight, fooling his masters with their own assumptions and prejudices, turning their confidence against them like a blade. And in doing so, he had shown that sometimes the most impossible escape is the one that happens right under the oppressor's nose, carried out by someone they never bothered to truly see. If this incredible story of courage and intelligence moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. History is full of untold stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we're here to bring them to light. What other amazing escapes from history would you like to hear about? Let us know in the comments below. The fictional story of Julius Freeman reminds us that freedom has always belonged to those brave enough to claim it, and that the human spirit, once awakened to its own power, cannot be contained by any system of oppression. In 1861, Julius, though a character born from imagination, proved that sometimes the boldest plan is the one that hides in plain sight, and that intelligence, courage, and determination can overcome even the most impossible odds. This narrative, while not based on real events, serves to inspire by showcasing the triumph of human will in the face of adversity.